I didn't come home that night. Zarya knew before she even checked her phone. She knew the way you know a storm is coming, not from the sky, but from something deeper in your bones. She'd nursed their 3-month-old son alone again, sitting in the dark nursery of a house that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, listening to the silence where a husband should have been. Lorenzo Kwan didn't stumble through the door until nearly 4 in the morning. He smelled like perfume that wasn't hers. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply walked past her like she was furniture, like she was part of the house he owned but never actually lived in. Stripped off his jacket and went to bed. Zarya stood in the hallway holding their sleeping son against her chest. And something inside her went very, very quiet. Not the quiet of defeat, the quiet of a decision. If you've ever been invisible to someone who was supposed to see you most, stay with me. Because this story doesn't end where you think it does. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way through. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't miss what comes next. You won't see it coming. The house on Meridian Ridge had 12 bedrooms, a private wine cellar, a cinema room, and a heated pool that nobody used between October and April. It sat behind iron gates at the end of a long private drive lined with oak trees, the kind of property that made people slow down when they drove past it, wondering who lived there and what they must have done to afford it. Most people in the surrounding county had theories. Lorenzo Kwan was known, loosely, carefully, as an international import businessman. That was the version that appeared in county records, tax filings, and the occasional charitable donation made to the local children's hospital. The version that kept attorneys employed and judges politely uninquisitive. The other version, the real one, existed in the kind of places where men spoke quietly and never looked each other directly in the eye for too long. Lorenzo was 39 years old, Korean-American, second generation, and had built something that stretched from the eastern seaboard down through the Gulf and into 3 countries that didn't share borders with the United States. He had a consigliere named Victor, a team of attorneys who worked exclusively for his organization, and a reputation that preceded him into every room he entered. Not the kind of reputation built from press releases. The kind built from what happened to the last man who tried to take something from him. He had charm when he chose to use it. Real charm, not the performed kind. He could make a room laugh, could read people with an accuracy that bordered on uncomfortable, could negotiate contracts over dinner and leave the other side feeling like they'd won something. He was not stupid. He was not reckless. He was, in almost every measurable way, extraordinarily successful. And he had been failing his wife for the better part of 8 months without understanding that failure was even occurring. Zarya Brooks Kwan had come into his life 6 years ago through a mutual acquaintance at an art auction in Atlanta. She'd been there supporting a friend whose sculpture was being featured, not buying anything herself, standing near the back in a burgundy dress that she'd altered herself because the original hem had been wrong. Lorenzo had noticed her immediately, not because she was trying to be noticed, which was the thing that caught him. Every other woman in that room was angled toward attention. Zarya was simply present, comfortable in her own body in a way that felt rare and almost radical in a space full of performance. He'd approached her with a line he'd used before. She'd looked at him with polite, unimpressed eyes and said, "That's a very smooth thing to say to someone you've never met." He'd laughed, a real one, surprised out of him, and spent the next 3 hours talking to her about nothing that mattered and everything that did. She was a graphic designer. She had her own small studio. She came from a tight family in Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of family that had Sunday dinners and remembered each other's birthdays without needing reminders. Her mother had raised 3 daughters, largely alone after her father's health declined, and Zarya had watched that woman hold an entire household together with grace and pragmatism and a refusal to collapse. She'd inherited all of that. Lorenzo had known within 6 months that he was going to marry her. He'd told Victor, who had said nothing for a long time, and then said, "Are you sure that's fair to her?" Lorenzo had dismissed the question. He shouldn't have. The first 3 years of their marriage had been good. Genuinely good, not just functional. He'd been present. He'd been attentive in the unpolished, imperfect way that felt real. He forgot anniversaries but remembered the small things, the specific tea she liked, the fact that she hated being startled from behind, the way she needed 20 minutes alone after large social events to decompress. He was not a perfect husband, but he was a trying one, and Zarya had loved him with the specific kind of love that doesn't ask for perfection, only honesty. Then the organization hit a period of expansion. 3 new territories, a significant restructuring of the supply chain running through the Gulf, a power vacuum and a competing network that needed to be navigated carefully. Lorenzo went from being occasionally absent to being almost entirely consumed. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself she understood. He had not actually asked her whether she understood. Somewhere in that second year of stretched absence, a woman named Celeste Marchetti reappeared in his life. Celeste was everything that Zarya was not. Not better, simply different in ways that required nothing from Lorenzo. She was decorative and uncomplicated in a way he mistook for ease. She had history with him from before Zarya, a brief and dramatic thing that had ended badly and should have stayed ended. She reappeared at a business dinner in Miami as someone else's guest, and she looked at him across the table with the particular expression of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Lorenzo was tired. He was stressed. He was a man who had spent years making enormous decisions and was now making a catastrophically small one. He called Celeste 2 weeks after that dinner. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself Zarya would never know. He told himself a lot of things that month. Zarya found out the way women often find out. Not through dramatic confrontation, not through a private investigator, but through the accumulation of small details that didn't add up. A receipt visible in a jacket pocket when she was pulling it out to take to the dry cleaner. A name that appeared twice on his phone screen when he left it unattended for 4 minutes. The specific quality of his absence when he was physically present, that glazed-over attentiveness of a man whose mind is somewhere else entirely. She didn't confront him immediately. She was 8 weeks pregnant when she made the first discovery. She sat with that information, the pregnancy, the probable affair, the specific loneliness of her current life. And she made a calculation that was not cold but was deeply careful. She was going to have this baby. She was going to give this marriage one final, private chance to correct itself. And if it didn't, she was going to need a plan. She had almost 6 months to make one. The baby came in February. A boy, healthy and loud and perfect in the way that newborns are perfect before life starts editing them. They named him Marcus, after Zarya's grandfather. Lorenzo was in the delivery room. She'd given him credit for that. He'd been present, genuinely shaken, and moved in the way that birth moves even men who are otherwise armored against feeling. For about 3 weeks after Marcus arrived, Lorenzo had been there. Then the organization pulled him back. A crisis in one of the Gulf operations, something that apparently required his physical presence, and then his continued attention for weeks afterward. He came home when he came home. He looked at his son with something that might have been love and might have been the idea of love, and then he answered another phone call. Zarya healed from childbirth alone. She managed the newborn's feeding schedule alone. She handled the sleeplessness and the engorgement and the specific emotional rawness of the postpartum weeks largely without her husband in any meaningful sense. Her mother came for 10 days, which saved her. After her mother left, she was alone in a 12-bedroom house with a newborn and a husband who was physically present approximately 40% of the time and emotionally present almost never. She also confirmed the affair. Not suspected, confirmed. She had a name, a location, a pattern of dates that aligned with Lorenzo's claimed business trips. She'd done this methodically, carefully, without confronting him, and she'd filed the information away in the same place she was filing everything else she was going to need. Because Zarya had been planning, not out of anger, or not only anger, out of the clear-eyed understanding that her son was growing up watching a marriage that would teach him the wrong things about what love looked like, and that this was something she could not allow to continue. She was not a woman who could be made invisible. She had watched her mother work too hard for too long, and she had promised herself something different, and she was not going to break that promise because it had become inconvenient. She reached out to an old college friend named Dana, a woman who worked in digital security consulting and who owed Zarya a favor that went back years to a time when Zarya had shown up at Dana's apartment with groceries and stayed for a week without asking for any explanation. Dana understood immediately what was being asked. She didn't ask many questions. Zarya began the process of quietly, legally accessing joint accounts to which she had full legal right. She moved money slowly, in amounts that wouldn't flag anything, into an account that Lorenzo had no visibility into. She researched relocation. She researched legal protections. She found an attorney in a city she'd never visited who specialized in exactly her kind of situation and who agreed after their first call to take her case. She did not tell her mother because her mother would have worried. She did not tell any mutual friends because mutual friends were a risk she couldn't take. She packed nothing visible. She organized nothing that could be noticed. She was meticulous in the specific way that women are meticulous when they've realized that their survival requires precision. In the second week of March, on a Tuesday night when Lorenzo sent a text at 9 p.m., saying he wouldn't be home until morning, something about a late meeting, the kind of excuse that had stopped even pretending to be convincing, Zarya sat in the nursery with Marcus in her arms and looked at the room she'd decorated herself, the soft blue walls and the small wooden mobile she'd chosen and the photographs arranged carefully on the dresser, and she made her final decision. She'd already done the hard part, the planning, the waiting, the performing normalcy, while carrying the weight of what she knew. That was behind her. What came next would look, to anyone observing from the outside, like a disappearance. To Zarya, it felt like the first breath she'd taken in months. She waited until she was certain Lorenzo wasn't coming home. Then she made the calls she needed to make. Her car was already loaded. She'd managed that over 3 separate days, casual trips to her car that looked like nothing. She had documentation for Marcus that she'd secured through proper legal channels without Lorenzo's awareness. She had the new identities Dana had helped arrange. IDs that weren't fake, but were legitimate through a legal process that most people didn't know existed, and Zarya had spent 6 weeks researching. She packed only what she and Marcus needed for the immediate future. She left the jewelry. She left the clothes she'd bought during the marriage. She took the photographs of her family, the ones that predated Lorenzo, and she took Marcus's stuffed rabbit because he'd started reaching for it, and she was not going to be the reason her son lost his rabbit. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, in the room where she'd made breakfast for a man who hadn't come home for it, and she took off her wedding ring. She placed it on the marble island where he would see it the moment he walked in. She didn't leave a note. Notes could be used as evidence. Notes could be used to track intent. Her attorney had been clear about that. She strapped Marcus into his car seat, backed out of the private drive for the last time, and drove through the gates as they swung closed behind her. She didn't cry until she reached the highway on-ramp. Then she cried for about 20 minutes, which was the appropriate response to the end of something that should have been her life. Then she stopped, because Marcus was making small sounds from the back seat, and she needed to focus. And she had a long drive ahead of her, and she was done spending her tears on a man who'd been spending his nights elsewhere. Lorenzo Kwan came home at 6:43 in the morning. He came through the front door the way he always did, already looking at his phone, already somewhere else mentally, the house quiet around him in the way he'd come to expect and had long stopped questioning. He dropped his keys on the entryway table. He walked toward the kitchen. He saw the ring on the marble counter before he saw anything else. He stared at it for what felt like a very long time. Then he went to the nursery. The crib was empty. The mobile turned slowly in the draft from the heating vent. The stuffed animals he'd bought but never chosen were still arranged on the shelf. The rabbit was gone. Small absence, enormous weight. He checked every room in the house. He told himself he was being irrational, that there was an explanation, that she'd gone to her mother's, that there was a reason he was being given right now and couldn't see yet. By the time he came back to the kitchen and picked up her wedding ring and held it in his palm, he understood that there was no explanation that made this accidental. He called her phone. Disconnected. He stood in the kitchen of his 12-bedroom house with his wife's wedding ring in his hand and his son's room empty 30 feet away, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, Lorenzo Kwan had absolutely no idea what to do next. The ring was cold in his palm, smooth. He'd had it made specifically. He remembered standing in the jeweler's, pleased with himself, choosing something that communicated what he'd wanted to communicate about who his wife was and what she was worth to him. She'd left it behind. She'd left it behind, and she'd taken their son, and she'd left no note, and her phone was disconnected, and the house around him was so entirely, completely empty that the sound of the heating vent was suddenly the loudest thing in the world. He sat down on the kitchen floor, which was not something Lorenzo Kwan did. Not a floor-sitting kind of man, not a man who found himself without options. He sat on the cold marble floor of his own kitchen and held his wife's ring and breathed through something he didn't have a word for yet. The feared man that half the eastern seaboard was careful not to cross sat alone in his empty house and discovered, at 6:51 in the morning, that every weapon he possessed was completely useless against the specific grief of a love he'd forgotten to tend. His phone buzzed. Business. Always business. He didn't answer it. He sat with the ring. Outside the kitchen window, the sun was beginning to come up over the oak trees that lined his private drive. Gold light across a perfect property. Everything he'd built, visible and enviable and entirely beside the point. His son had a rabbit that he reached for now. Lorenzo had noticed that once, noticed and thought, he likes that thing, and then answered a phone call. He hadn't asked what the rabbit's name was. He didn't know what his son's rabbit was named. He pressed his back against the kitchen cabinet and stayed on that floor for a long time, while his phone kept buzzing and the house stayed empty and the sun came fully up outside, indifferent and unhurried, the way the sun always is when a man's life has just rearranged itself completely around him. Victor Seo arrived at the house on Meridian Ridge at 8:17 in the morning, 43 minutes after Lorenzo's first call. He came alone, which was protocol for anything this sensitive. He used his own key, walked through the front door, found the house exactly as quiet as Lorenzo had described, and followed the sound of nothing to the kitchen. Lorenzo was still on the floor, not sitting anymore. He'd moved at some point, was now leaning against the cabinet with his knees pulled up and one hand flat on the marble beside him, his jacket still on, his tie loosened but not removed. He looked like a man who'd been processing something for hours and hadn't finished yet. Victor looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the ring on the counter. He didn't say anything right away, which was one of the things Lorenzo had always valued about him. Victor Seo was 61 years old, had been in the organization since before Lorenzo took it over, and had survived 3 leadership transitions through the specific skill of understanding when to speak and when to simply be present. He crossed the kitchen, picked up the ring, turned it over in his fingers once, and set it back down. "How long has she been gone?" "I don't know." Lorenzo's voice was rough. "I came home at 6:40. She was already—" He stopped. "The car is gone. Her phone's been disconnected. Not off. Disconnected. Different number entirely." Victor pulled out a chair from the kitchen table and sat down. He didn't comment on Lorenzo being on the floor. "Did she leave anything else?" "No." "Nothing in the bedroom? No documents missing from the safe?" Lorenzo went still. He hadn't checked the safe. He got up from the floor in a single movement, less fluid than usual, and went to the study. Victor followed. The safe behind the bookcase was closed, the combination untouched as far as Lorenzo could tell, but when he opened it, he found that the copies of Marcus's birth documents were gone. The originals had been filed elsewhere. Lorenzo kept copies. The copies were gone. He also found that 2 folders of financial documentation that related to the joint accounts were missing. Clean removal. No other disruption. "She planned this," Lorenzo said. "Yes." Victor's voice was even. "She did." "How long?" It wasn't really a question. Victor answered it anyway. "Based on what's missing? Months, at minimum." Lorenzo stood with the empty safe in front of him and breathed through his nose. He was doing the math. 3 months since Marcus was born. 8 months since the expansion started. He was calculating backward through his own absence like a man reading damage after a storm, trying to figure out when the roof had actually started going. "I need you to find her." "Lorenzo, I need you to find her, Victor. She has my son." "She has her son." Victor's voice didn't change tone. That was the most dangerous version of Victor, the even one. Legally, she has every right to take her child. She's his mother. There was no custody order. There's no... She disappeared. That's not illegal. Victor sat down in the chair across from the desk. A wife leaving her husband is not illegal. A mother taking her infant child is not illegal. If you go after her the way I know you're thinking about going after her, you will be in violation of... I know what I'll be in violation of. Then you know I can't support this the way I'd support other things. They looked at each other across the desk. 20 years of work between them. 20 years of Lorenzo making calls that other men wouldn't make, and Victor finding ways to make those calls sustainable. This was the first time the look between them had this particular quality, the quality of a line that hadn't existed before and was now visible. "I'm not asking you to do anything illegal," Lorenzo said. "I'm asking you to find her. Finding her using our network is... Find her." Victor exhaled slowly. He looked at the empty safe. He looked at Lorenzo, who was standing very straight now, the way he stood when he was containing something enormous, and who was looking back with eyes that were not the eyes of a man making a business decision. Victor recognized that look. He'd seen it once before, years ago, when Lorenzo's younger brother had died. The look of a man who had run out of the protective layer that keeps grief from becoming something more dangerous. "I'll make some calls," Victor said finally. "But Lorenzo..." He waited until Lorenzo looked at him directly. "Whatever I find, we handle it right. We don't drag her back. We don't threaten. We don't..." "I know." "Do you?" The silence held for 3 full seconds. "Make the calls," Lorenzo said. Victor made the calls. By noon, every informant in Lorenzo's network who operated within a 200-mile radius had been quietly activated. Not with threats, with money. Substantial money. The kind that made people remember things they might otherwise decide they hadn't seen. Surveillance footage from highway rest stops, toll records that could be accessed through channels that existed in the gray space between legal and not. Gas station attendants who might have noticed a woman with a baby in the last 12 hours. Nothing came back. By 4 in the afternoon, Lorenzo's attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had worked exclusively for the organization for 11 years, arrived at the house on Meridian Ridge. He came in through the front door, set his briefcase on the kitchen table, and looked at Lorenzo with the carefully neutral expression he reserved for situations that were going to require him to say things his client didn't want to hear. "You need to file for custody," Gerald said. "Officially, through the courts. That's the legitimate path, and it's the one I can actually help you with. That takes months. It takes as long as it takes. In the meantime, you have no legal mechanism to compel her return." Gerald opened his briefcase. "She's not violating any law by leaving with Marcus. In the absence of a custody order..." "I know there's no custody order. We were married. We didn't need..." "You do now." Lorenzo looked at the papers Gerald was laying out on the table. He didn't pick them up. He'd spent his entire adult life in spaces where he was the one with leverage, the one who set the terms, the one whose patience was the most powerful thing in the room because everyone else was more afraid than he was. Courts were the one room where that calculus didn't apply. "File it," he said. "I will. But you should know..." Gerald paused, which meant what came next was the thing he'd been building toward. "If she's retained her own attorney, and if she files first, she controls the initial narrative. Whatever she says about the state of the marriage, about the environment Marcus was being raised in, about your..." Another pause, shorter. "Your presence at home and your professional associations. She doesn't know about the professional associations." Gerald looked at him with the expression of a man who had learned over 11 years not to say everything he was thinking. "File it," Lorenzo said again. "Today." Gerald filed it. And somewhere in the process of the afternoon, while Lorenzo was fielding calls he couldn't ignore and Victor was coordinating the search, and Gerald was drafting paperwork, the word got out. Not publicly. Inside. Within the structure of the organization, the way information always moved, through the particular telephone of men who worked close enough to the top to know things but far enough from it to talk about them. By evening, there were people who knew that Lorenzo Kwan's wife had left him and taken the baby. By the following morning, there were people who had opinions about it. Ramon Cruz heard about it at a steak dinner in Miami, through someone who'd heard it from someone who'd been at the house. Ramon was 34, ran the Gulf operation with efficiency that Lorenzo had relied on for 3 years, and had an ego that required constant monitoring. He'd been restless for the better part of 6 months, pushing for more autonomy, more territory, more acknowledgement. Lorenzo had been managing that restlessness carefully. Now Lorenzo was distracted. Ramon filed that information away in the precise place where ambitious men file things they might be able to use. Dominic Park, who ran the Eastern operations and had been with the organization even longer than Victor, called Lorenzo directly. That call happened at 9:47 that evening, when Lorenzo was alone in the house again, sitting at his desk with a glass of something he wasn't drinking. "I heard," Dominic said, without preamble. "I know you heard. You need to get your head right." "My head is fine." A beat. Dominic had 22 years in this life and the particular patience of a man who had survived by reading situations accurately. "We've got the Nakamura negotiation in 9 days. They specifically requested your presence. If you're..." "I'll be there." "Lorenzo?" I'll be there, Dominic. Another beat. Is there anything I can do? Find Victor and ask him what he needs from you on the search. Dominic didn't say what he was thinking, which was that searching for a woman who'd legally left with her legal child was the kind of thing that created problems of a specific variety. He said, "Understood," and ended the call. Lorenzo set his phone on the desk and looked at the glass he wasn't drinking from. 3 days passed. They were the longest 3 days of Lorenzo's adult life, which was a statement that carried weight given some of the days his adult life had contained. The house was wrong in a way he couldn't pinpoint, and then could. It was wrong because it was just a house now. It had been edging toward just a house for months, but Zaria's presence, even her distant, carrying something heavy presence, had kept it from tipping fully over. Now it had tipped. The nursery especially. He kept finding himself walking past the nursery door, not going in, not quite walking all the way past either. On the second day, he went in. He stood at the empty crib and put his hand on the mattress where Marcus slept. The sheets were still there. Zaria had taken the rabbit but left the crib sheet pale blue with small white stars, and it still smelled faintly of the baby lotion she'd been using on Marcus's skin since he came home from the hospital. Lorenzo stood at that crib for 11 minutes. He counted, because counting was the only thing keeping his breathing even. He thought about the night Marcus was born, the specific weight of holding his son for the first time, that terrifying, impossible lightness of a person who had just arrived in the world and was not yet strong enough to hold his own head. He'd held Marcus, and something in his chest had done something he didn't have language for, a kind of restructuring, a before and after quality. And then his phone had rung, and he had answered it. On the third day, Victor came back with something. He came into the study without knocking, which meant it was significant, and he sat down across from Lorenzo without being asked, which meant it was very significant. "Dana Reyes," Victor said. Lorenzo didn't recognize the name. Victor could see that. "Old college friend of your wife's, works in digital security. She was the one who helped Zaria cover her tracks. The financial moves, the communications blackout. Dana's good, but she's not invisible." He set a folder on the desk. "She flew out of Reagan National 8 months ago for a work contract. The company she contracted with is based in Asheville, North Carolina. She's been back twice since. Both times coincide with dates that," Victor paused, "that were significant. One was around when Zaria would have started planning in earnest. The other was 6 weeks ago." Lorenzo opened the folder. He looked at the documentation without picking it up. "Does this tell us where Zaria is?" "Not precisely, but it tells us the general region. Dana's work contract is in western North Carolina. The mountain region. If she helped Zaria relocate, she'd have used somewhere she knew." Lorenzo closed the folder. "I don't want to go in with a team," he said. "I know. I want one person, someone good enough to find an address without creating noise. Not someone who's going to knock on a door or make contact. Find the address and come back." Victor was quiet for a moment. "There's a man named Calloway, freelance, private investigator background, but crossed into our kind of work years ago. He's discreet, he's effective, and he operates alone. Get him. It's going to take time." "I have time." Lorenzo said it with a flatness that meant the opposite. "Get him." Victor got him. Calloway was 51, thin in the way that made him look taller than he was, with the kind of face that people forgot immediately after he left a room. He arrived at Meridian Ridge 4 days later, listened to what was wanted without asking questions that weren't necessary, named his fee without negotiating, and left. He was back in 11 days. During those 11 days, the organization did not stop. The Nakamura negotiation happened, and Lorenzo was there, sitting at the table, saying the right things, making the right calls, and existing somewhere else entirely inside his own head. Dominic noticed but said nothing. Victor noticed and said only what was necessary. The Nakamura deal closed on terms that were acceptable, not exceptional, which was the first time in years that Lorenzo had walked away from a table with acceptable instead of exceptional. Ramon Cruz, in Miami, noted this too. On the 8th of those 11 days, Celeste Marchetti called. Lorenzo stood at his desk and watched her name on his screen and felt something he hadn't expected to feel, which was nothing. Not anger. Not the complicated pull of whatever that had been. Just nothing. A number on a screen that used to mean something and now was just evidence. just the specific evidence of where he'd been spending his attention while his wife had been sitting alone in a nursery. He declined the call. She called again the following morning. He declined again. She texted, "I heard. I'm sorry. Call me if you need anything." He read it. He set the phone down. He went to the nursery and stood at the empty crib and stayed there until his breathing was even again. Calloway came back on a Wednesday afternoon. He came in, sat across from Lorenzo, and put a single folded piece of paper on the desk. "Mountain town about 40 minutes outside of Asheville," Calloway said. "Small. Population under 2,000. She's renting a house on the northern edge of town, property registered under a name that's legitimate but not her birth name." He paused. "She's got local connections already, friendly with some of the neighbors. The town has a small police department, 2 officers and a chief. She's been seen talking to the chief twice in the past 3 weeks." He said this without inflection, but Lorenzo heard it clearly. "She's not hiding anymore. She's settled." Lorenzo looked at the folded paper. "The baby?" "Healthy. Saw him in the yard twice, growing fast." Calloway said this last part in the same neutral voice, and then seemed to notice that Lorenzo's hand had stopped moving on the armrest. "He's fine. She's taking good care of him." Lorenzo picked up the paper, opened it, read the address, folded it again. "That's everything you needed?" Calloway asked. "That's everything," Lorenzo said. Calloway left. Lorenzo sat with the address for a long time. Then he called Victor. "I found her," he said. Victor's pause was the specific pause of a man deciding how to respond to information he'd both hoped for and dreaded. "What do you want to do?" "I'm going alone." "Lorenzo?" "Alone, Victor. That's not... She's already talked to the local police chief twice. She saw this coming. You understand?" Lorenzo's voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there in the earlier conversations. Something that had been compacted by 11 days of living in an empty house. "She expected me to find her. She prepared for it. If I come in with people, with resources, with the weight of..." He stopped. "I go alone." "And what happens when you get there?" "I don't know yet." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have." Victor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had moved into a different register, older, more private, the voice he used only occasionally, and only when he meant something he didn't want the professional relationship to absorb. "She's not afraid of you, Lorenzo. Understand that before you walk through whatever door you're about to walk through. She has never been afraid of you, and she's had months to make sure she doesn't have to be. You can't go in there as what you are and expect, 'I know what I am.'" "Do you know what she is?" The line was quiet. "Drive safe," Victor said, and ended the call. Lorenzo booked nothing. He packed a single bag. He told no one in the organization where he was going, which was the first time in years he'd moved without anyone knowing his location. And the anonymity of it felt strange, and also, underneath the strangeness, something that was almost like relief. He left Meridian Ridge at 5 in the morning in a car that wasn't his usual car, wearing clothes that were less conspicuous than his usual clothes, and drove west and then south. For the first 3 hours, his mind moved through logistics the way it always did. Contingencies, variables, possible outcomes. He was a man who planned, and he planned this, walking through versions of what might happen when he arrived. In the 4th hour, somewhere in the mountains, when the road narrowed and the trees pressed close on both sides, and the early light was coming through in columns that made everything look temporary, he stopped planning. He thought about Marcus. Not Marcus as a concept, as his son, as a thing he had the right to. Marcus specifically. The weight of him, the smell of his head, the way he'd started tracking motion with his eyes around the 6-week mark, in a way that had seemed remarkable to Lorenzo, even as he'd immediately answered a phone call afterward. The way Marcus had started making sounds that weren't quite sounds, just the rehearsal of language, the attempt at it, the mouth trying to figure out what it was for. Lorenzo hadn't been there for most of that. He drove through the mountains with that knowledge sitting directly on his chest, not moving, not lightening. He was 45 minutes from the address when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Not Victor, not Dominic, not Celeste. It was a number he didn't recognize with a Western North Carolina area code. He answered it. "Mr. Kwan." A woman's voice, measured, professional, not warm. "My name is Chief Patricia Odom. I'm the chief of police in, she said the name of the town on the folded paper in his glove compartment. And I'm calling because someone in my town asked me to reach out to you before you arrived. Lorenzo's hands didn't tighten on the wheel. She knows I'm coming. She's known for about a week, Chief Odom said. I want to be very clear with you about what that means. It means she's had a week to speak with her attorney, to speak with me, and to make sure that whatever happens next happens in a context where everyone's rights are clearly understood. A brief pause. You have the right to see your son. That's not what I'm calling about. I'm calling because I want you to understand before you get here that this is a small town, and I know everyone in it, and one of them asked for my help, and I said yes. Lorenzo looked at the road ahead of him, the trees, the columns of light. Mr. Kwan. I heard you, he said. Good. Chief Odom's voice shifted slightly, not warmer, but more direct, the way someone speaks when they've decided to say the actual thing. She's not the woman who ran away. She's the woman who got to where she was going. There's a difference. I think you know that. Lorenzo said nothing. She'll be at the town park on Cedar Street at 10 a.m. tomorrow, Odom said, with Marcus. If you want to see your son, that's where you should go. Not her house, not at night, not with anyone else. Another pause. She suggested this. Not me. She wants you to see him. Lorenzo pulled over onto the shoulder of the mountain road. He sat with the engine running and the trees close on both sides and the phone against his ear. She wants me to see him, he said, and it wasn't quite a question. She does, Chief Odom said. She's not keeping Marcus from his father. She's keeping Marcus from a version of his life she doesn't want him growing up in. Those are different things. The chief's voice was factual, not unkind. 10 a.m. Cedar Street Park. Come alone and come with nothing to prove. The line ended. Lorenzo sat on the shoulder of the mountain road with his engine running and the morning light coming through the trees and a folded piece of paper in his glove compartment that he no longer needed. She'd known he was coming. She'd been ready. She'd reached out to the police chief not to protect herself from him, but to set the terms of what happened next. To make sure that when he walked into her world, he walked in on ground that was even, on terms that were fair, in a context that was visible and documented and clean. She had not run from him. She had arrived somewhere, and she had waited. Lorenzo put the car in drive and continued down the mountain road, and he understood, in a way that sat differently from anything he'd felt in the previous 2 weeks, that every instinct he'd trusted his entire adult life, force, leverage, the controlled application of pressure, was going to be useless tomorrow morning. He had never in his life walked into a room without the advantage. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., on a public street in a small mountain town, a woman who had once loved him was going to look at him across a distance that had nothing to do with geography, and he had absolutely nothing to offer her except the fact that he had come. He found a motel 9 miles outside of town. Not a hotel. A motel. The kind with exterior doors that opened directly onto a parking lot, with a vending machine that hummed too loud in the corridor and a mattress that had been slept on by too many strangers. Lorenzo Kwan had not stayed in a place like this in 17 years. He set his single bag on the luggage rack, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at the wall. It was 7:40 in the evening. He had 14 hours until 10 a.m. He didn't eat. He thought about eating and then sat back down. He'd passed a diner coming into the motel lot and had looked at it through the windshield and felt nothing that resembled hunger. He drank water from the bathroom tap because the cup wrapped in plastic on the sink felt like too much effort to unwrap, and that small absurdity. Lorenzo Kwan, who had negotiated million-dollar contracts over 5-course meals, unable to unwrap a plastic cup, sat with him in the silence of the motel room as something almost honest. He called Victor at 8. "I'm here," he said. "How is it?" "Quiet." Victor waited. "She called the local police chief. Already had the terms arranged before I got here. Cedar Street Park, 10 a.m. Just me." Lorenzo leaned back against the headboard. "She's been planning for me to come the same way she planned everything else." "That doesn't surprise me," Victor said carefully. "She wants me to see Marcus." A brief pause on Victor's end. "That's something." "It doesn't feel like something. It feels like a controlled environment she's had weeks to prepare." Lorenzo said this without bitterness, or tried to, but it came out with an edge he hadn't intended. "She's not afraid of me, Victor. The police chief made that very clear." "I told you she wouldn't be." "You told me." He looked at the ceiling. Water stain in one corner, old and brown-edged. I keep trying to find the angle, the leverage point, what I can say tomorrow that gets me something back. He stopped. There's nothing. There's no angle. I walk in there and I'm just a man. Not even a man with a good record. Just a man who failed his wife and wants his son back. Victor was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was in that older, more private voice again. Then maybe that's what you go in as. Lorenzo didn't answer. Sleep if you can, Victor said. He couldn't sleep. He lay in the motel room with the parking lot light coming through the gap in the curtains and ran through everything he'd thought he'd known for the last 11 days, looking for the thing he'd missed, and kept arriving at the same place. He hadn't missed a tactical error. He'd committed a human one. Those were different categories, and he didn't have a playbook for the second kind. At 2 in the morning, his phone buzzed with a message from Dominic. Ramon's been making calls, lateral ones. You should know. Lorenzo read it twice, understood exactly what it meant. Ramon reaching sideways, building relationships without going through the vertical chain, the specific move of a man who was calculating a power vacuum, and set the phone face down on the nightstand. He'd deal with that when he got back. If there was a back to get to, that looked the same as what he'd left. He slept for maybe 3 hours. Fitful, surface level. He dreamed about the nursery at Meridian Ridge, the mobile turning in the draft, and woke at 5:43 with the taste of something wrong in his mouth and the specific disorientation of not knowing where he was for 4 full seconds. Then he remembered, and the remembering was its own kind of landing. He showered. He had one set of clothes that wasn't his organizational uniform, dark jeans, a plain charcoal shirt, nothing that communicated what he was. He'd packed deliberately. He stood at the motel mirror and looked at himself for a moment, this face that had made rooms go quiet, and tried to figure out what it would look like to someone who hadn't decided to be afraid of it. He thought it probably still looked like a man who was used to being obeyed. He drove into town at 9:30, parked on a side street 2 blocks from Cedar, and walked. The town was the kind of small that felt intentional rather than accidental. Maintained, community-oriented, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors' names and the hardware store had been owned by the same family for 3 generations. He walked its main street with his hands in his jacket pockets and felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, how completely alien he was here. The park on Cedar Street was small, a square block with mature trees and a playground structure at one end and benches arranged along the perimeter. At 9:50, it was mostly empty. A man walking a dog on the far side. An older woman on one of the benches reading something. Lorenzo sat on a bench near the entrance and waited. At 9:58, a police cruiser rolled slowly past the park entrance. Didn't stop, just passed. He recognized it for what it was: presence, visibility, the chief making sure he knew the context hadn't changed overnight. He nodded slightly at the cruiser as it passed, which was the appropriate acknowledgement. At 10:03, he saw them. Zaria came from the north end of the street, on foot, pushing Marcus in a stroller that was practical rather than expensive. Nothing like the top-of-the-line piece Lorenzo had ordered delivered to Meridian Ridge before Marcus was born. She was wearing a dark green jacket he'd never seen before, and her hair was pulled back and she was walking at a pace that was unhurried, not performing confidence, just carrying it. A woman who lived here, who belonged here. Beside her, matching her pace with her hands in her coat pockets and her eyes already on Lorenzo, was a woman he didn't recognize. Mid-40s, compact, alert. She peeled off at the park entrance, took up a position near the gate without being asked. Not a friend. Something more specific than a friend. Her attorney, Lorenzo understood. Or close enough. Zaria pushed the stroller down the path toward his bench and stopped 10 feet away. She looked at him. She looked the same, was his first thought. His second thought corrected it. She didn't look the same at all. The woman he'd last seen moving quietly through a house she'd already left in every way that mattered had been carrying something enormous and invisible. This woman was not carrying it anymore. She looked like someone who had put down a weight they'd been carrying so long they'd forgotten it wasn't part of them. "Lorenzo," she said. "Zaria." She reached down and unclipped the stroller harness and lifted Marcus out, holding him against her chest, and turned him so he was facing outward, facing Lorenzo. Marcus was bigger. 3 months of baby growth, which is significant growth, and the infant Lorenzo had last held was now a more present, more definite small person with his mother's eyes and something around the forehead that was unmistakably Quan. He was looking at Lorenzo with the unfocused, serious attention that babies give to things they haven't categorized yet. Lorenzo's throat closed. He didn't move from the bench because she hadn't signaled that movement was appropriate, and he was, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, taking his cues from someone else's terms entirely. "You can come closer," Zarya said. He stood up slowly and crossed the distance. He stopped an arm's length away. Marcus looked up at him with those serious eyes and made a sound. Not a word, not a cry, just the particular sound of a person encountering something new. "Hey, bud," Lorenzo said. His voice came out lower than he intended and with a roughness that wasn't planned. "Hey." Marcus blinked. They stood like that for almost a minute, the three of them, in the thin mountain town morning sun, and then Zarya said, "Walk with me," and turned back toward the path without checking whether he was following. He followed. They walked in silence for almost the full length of the path before she spoke. How long have you known where I was?" "Since Wednesday. You waited 2 days. I didn't know what I was walking into." She glanced at him sideways. Not unkindly, not warmly either, with the assessment of someone who had spent months studying a situation from the inside. "That's honest, at least." "I'm trying to be." She looked forward again, shifted Marcus slightly against her chest. "The chief told me you came alone." "I came alone." "Victor didn't want you to." "No." A breath of something that might have been acknowledgement. Not a laugh, not quite. "Victor's smarter than you on this one." "On most things," Lorenzo said. "I don't say that lightly." She walked another 20 feet. "What do you want, Lorenzo? Not what you're going to say you want, what you actually came here for." He'd been walking toward this question for 11 days and hadn't found an answer that satisfied him, so he gave her the one that was true rather than the one that was composed. "I want to know my son, and I don't know how to ask for that as something I deserve, because I don't think I deserve it. So I'm asking for it as something I want to work toward." Zarya stopped walking. She stood on the park path holding Marcus and looked at the middle distance for a moment, and Lorenzo watched something move across her face that was complicated and unresolvable and entirely her own. "That's the first true thing you've said to me in about 14 months, she said. It landed precisely as hard as it was intended to. "I know," he said. She looked at him then, directly, the full weight of it. "I know about Celeste. I've known since I was 8 weeks pregnant. I want you to understand that while I was in that house, managing a pregnancy and a newborn, and the silence you left behind, I was also carrying the specific knowledge of what you were doing and who you were doing it with." Her voice was even, not performatively so, but with the flatness of something that had been processed until the acute pain was gone and what remained was just fact. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because I need you to understand the full picture of what you walked away from, so that whatever comes next is built on what actually happened, rather than the version where you were just busy." Lorenzo held her gaze. He owed her that, at minimum. "I understand." "Do you know why I'm here? Not why I left. Why I'm standing in this park right now. Because Marcus needs a father. Because Marcus needs the right version of his father, and I don't know yet if that exists." She shifted Marcus to her other hip, a practiced move, maternal efficiency, the body knowledge of someone who had spent months being the only one. "I didn't come to this park to punish you. I came because my attorney told me that if there's any path forward for Marcus to have both parents functional in his life, it starts with me not making it impossible." She paused. She was right. I don't have to like it. You have every reason not to. I don't need you to validate my reasons, Lorenzo. I know what my reasons are. He almost said something and stopped himself. She noticed him stop himself, and something shifted slightly in her expression, fractional, but he caught it, because he had always been able to read rooms and she had always been his most difficult and most necessary read. "Patricia told me you answered her call," Zarya said, "that you pulled over." "Yes." She said she could hear it, that you pulled over. She looked at Marcus for a moment, at his small, serious face, at the particular way his fist was currently wrapped around the lapel of her jacket. "That mattered to me. That you stopped." She said this carefully, like a woman laying down one card and very deliberately not the rest of the hand. He understood. It was not an opening. It was an acknowledgement that he had done one small correct thing in a field of larger incorrect ones. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you go back to wherever you're staying. My attorney will be in contact with yours about a custody arrangement. Supervised visits, structured, until the court has enough information to make a determination." She was looking at him steadily. "You don't come to this town without going through proper channels. You don't make contact with me outside of legal process. You don't—" She paused, and something beneath the evenness surfaced briefly. "You don't send people here. Don't have people watching this town. That ends now." He nodded. "I need you to say it." "It ends," he said. "I'll call it off today." She studied him for 3 seconds with the eyes of a woman who had learned, at some cost, not to take him at face value. Then she gave Marcus a slight repositioning, turned the baby toward Lorenzo again. "Say goodbye to your dad," she said quietly. To Marcus, not to Lorenzo. But Lorenzo heard it, and the word dad in her mouth, applied to him without sarcasm, in this context, in this park, hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. He reached out and touched Marcus's hand. Marcus's fingers closed around one of his automatically, the reflex grip of an infant, unknowing and total. Lorenzo stood on that park path and let his son hold his finger and did not say anything for a long moment, because there was nothing to say that was proportionate to what was happening inside his chest. "Okay," he finally said, quiet, just to Marcus. "Okay, bud." He drove back to Meridian Ridge that afternoon. The house received him the same way it had been receiving him for 2 weeks, with its 12 rooms and its marble surfaces and its perfect, expensive emptiness. He walked in, set his bag down, stood in the entry hall, and understood that the house and everything it represented was a problem he'd need to solve eventually, but not today. He called Victor. "Stand down the search, all of it. Anyone watching the western North Carolina region, pull them." Victor was quiet for a beat. "Understood. How was it?" "She's fine. Marcus is fine." He paused. "She's better than fine. That's the honest answer." "And you?" He looked at the empty house around him. "I need to talk to Gerald about custody filings. Real ones, cooperative, not adversarial." "That's a different approach than where you started." "I know." "What changed?" Lorenzo didn't answer immediately. He walked down the hall toward the kitchen, past the nursery door which he'd started leaving open because the closed door was worse. "I'll explain later. Get Gerald on the phone for me." He got Gerald on the phone. Gerald listened to the shift in approach with the careful neutrality of a man recalibrating, asked several precise legal questions, and began drafting the modified filing approach. The word cooperative appeared in his notes where contested had appeared before. It was a substantive change. It would make things slower and longer and less controllable, and ultimately more likely to result in something Lorenzo could actually live with. 3 days after he returned from the mountains, Ramon Cruz called. Not through organizational channels, directly. Lorenzo's cell, personal line, which Ramon had as a function of his position and had never used for anything other than emergencies. It was not an emergency call. Lorenzo recognized that from the first second, from the quality of the silence before Ramon spoke, the specific composition of it. "I've been thinking," Ramon said. "About what?" "The Nakamura deal. The terms you walked away with." "The terms were acceptable. They were below what we've taken from that table in the past 2 years." A pause, carefully measured. "I'm not criticizing, I'm noting." "Are you?" "I'm noting," Ramon repeated with a smoothness that had a different texture now than it had 6 months ago, "that the last 3 weeks have been unsettled, from a leadership standpoint." Lorenzo sat with that word. Unsettled, chosen with precision, the kind of precision that came from rehearsal. "What exactly," Lorenzo said slowly, "are you telling me, Ramon?" "I'm not telling you anything. I'm checking in." "You don't call this number to check in." Another pause. Shorter this time, which meant he hadn't prepared a response for Lorenzo cutting through the framing this quickly. "Things are moving fast in the Gulf sector. I've had some conversations with..." "With who?" Silence. "Ramon." Lorenzo's voice had dropped into the register that made rooms go quiet. It had been absent for weeks, swallowed by grief and guilt, and the specific disorientation of his personal life dismantling itself. It was back now, present, and precise. "Who have you been talking to?" Connections, business, lateral business. He was thinking of Dominic's text. Ramon's been making calls, lateral ones. You've been using these 3 weeks to position. I've been keeping things moving while I was distracted. Lorenzo stood up from the kitchen table. He was very still when he was most dangerous, and he was very still now. You looked at what happened with Zarya, and you saw a window. You've been 3 weeks in that window. You're reading this wrong. Am I? The silence that followed was the kind that answered the question. Lorenzo let it breathe for a long moment. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to come to Meridian Ridge on Friday. In person, not through a proxy. We're going to sit at this table, and you're going to tell me every conversation you've had in the last 3 weeks that didn't go through proper channels. Everyone. And then we're going to decide together what your role looks like going forward. Lorenzo. Friday, Ramon. He ended the call. He stood at the kitchen counter and breathed through what had just surfaced inside him. Not quite anger, something colder and more methodical. The organizational mind coming back online after weeks of operating at reduced capacity. He'd let 3 weeks pass without projecting enough presence. He'd been so consumed by what had collapsed in his personal life that he hadn't maintained sufficient visibility in the professional one. Ramon had seen it. Others might have seen it too. He called Dominic. I need a full status report. Everyone, every sector, tonight. Dominic didn't say I told you so, which Lorenzo appreciated. He said, I'll have it to you by 9. Lorenzo got the report at 9:12. He read it at the kitchen table with the focused attention he hadn't given to anything in 3 weeks, and by the time he finished, he had 3 separate problems with Ramon and a potential 4th with a supplier in the Gulf who had started acting with slightly too much independence during the same window. 3 weeks. That was all it had taken. 3 weeks of reduced visibility, and 2 problems had become 4. He sent Gerald a message about the custody filing. He sent Victor a briefing on Ramon. He sat at the kitchen table past midnight going through the Dominic report line by line, building a framework for how to address what had grown in his absence. And then, because it was after midnight and the house was empty and the nursery door was open at the end of the hall, he set down the work and sat in the quiet and let the 2 realities he was now living in exist simultaneously in the same space for a moment. The organization, which had been his primary life for almost 2 decades and which had just demonstrated very clearly the cost of inattention. And Marcus, who was 45 minutes outside of Asheville in a mountain town, sleeping in whatever bed Zarya had set up for him, growing at the unreasonable rate that babies grow, learning things every day that Lorenzo wasn't there to witness. These 2 lives did not coexist without cost. He had always known that, in theory. He was learning it now in practice, and the practice was considerably more brutal than the theory. His phone buzzed at 12:43 a.m. Victor. Ramon met with Chen Wei last Tuesday, Chicago. That's who he's been talking to. Lorenzo read it twice. Chen Wei was not a business contact. Chen Wei was the kind of name that existed in a specific and dangerous category. A man who operated in a different network, a competing one, and who had been making moves in the Gulf for the better part of a year. The kind of moves that required intelligence about the current network structure, its leadership, its weaknesses, its leadership's 3-week distraction. Lorenzo set the phone down on the kitchen table. He looked at it. He looked at the kitchen around him, the marble island, the cabinet he'd sat against on the floor 2 weeks ago, his wife's wedding ring that he'd moved to the shelf in the study because he couldn't leave it on the counter but couldn't put it away either. Ramon Cruz had met with Chen Wei. This was no longer an ambitious lieutenant testing the edges of a distracted boss. This was something else entirely. This was the kind of move that, in Lorenzo's world, had only one legitimate response. The kind that he'd made before, without hesitation, without the specific complication now standing between him and that response. Because Lorenzo Quan was now a man in the middle of a cooperative custody filing. A man who had stood in a park with his infant son and felt something restructure in his chest. A man who had told his wife, in the only honest terms available to him, that he wanted to be something worth trusting. The man who dealt with Ramon Cruz the way Ramon Cruz deserved to be dealt with was the man who made his wife take their son and disappear. He sat at the kitchen table at 12:43 in the morning with both versions of himself making simultaneous and incompatible demands, and for the first time in his life, Lorenzo Quan understood that he could not be both things. He could not run the organization the way the organization required and be the father the custody court would need to see. He could not deal with Chen Wei and Ramon Cruz in the manner his world demanded and be the man standing in a park on Cedar Street who a child might someday call dad without irony. These were not complementary identities. They had never been. He had simply never been required to look at them in the same room at the same time before. He picked up his phone. He looked at Victor's message for a long time. Then he opened a new message and typed 4 words that he had never in 20 years of running his organization typed to anyone. I need your advice. Not strategy, not options, not a framework for handling Ramon, not the organizational calculation. He needed someone who had watched him for 20 years to tell him what a man did when the thing he had built and the person he was trying to become could not exist in the same future. Victor's response came back in 6 minutes, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he'd been waiting for exactly this message. I've been waiting for you to ask that, Victor wrote. Come to my house in the morning. Leave the phones in the car. Lorenzo set his phone face down on the kitchen table and sat in his empty house with 2 incompatible versions of his own life pressing from both sides, and understood that whatever he decided in the next 24 hours was going to determine not just who he was, but who his son would someday understand his father to have been. Victor Seo lived in a house that nobody in the organization had ever been invited to. Not because it was hidden. It was on a residential street in a suburb 40 minutes from Meridian Ridge. Unremarkable from the outside, 2-car garage, and a front garden that his wife had planted and tended for 23 years until she passed. It was simply the one place Victor had always kept separate, the wall between what he did and where he lived. Lorenzo had known the address for 20 years and had never used it. He used it now. He left his phones in the car the way Victor had said. Both of them. He sat in Victor's driveway for a moment after turning off the engine, listening to the quiet of a neighborhood that had no idea what kind of men were about to have breakfast in it, and then he got out and knocked on the front door. Victor opened it in the kind of clothes that meant he'd been awake for hours. Slacks, a collared shirt, but no jacket. The version of himself he never showed at the office. He looked at Lorenzo for a second, then stepped back to let him in. The inside of the house smelled like coffee and old wood and something floral that was probably still his wife's soap or lotion, kept somewhere out of habit or grief or both. Family photographs covered one wall of the hallway. Victor's kids, grown now. His wife at various ages. One photograph of Victor himself, much younger, that Lorenzo had never seen. Probably late 20s, standing somewhere outdoors, grinning at something off camera with a looseness he no longer carried. Lorenzo followed him to the kitchen. Victor poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and sat across from him at a table that had the worn surface of something used daily for decades. Tell me about Ramon, Victor said. You already know about Ramon. I know the facts. Tell me what you're going to do about it. Lorenzo wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. It was hot, and he needed the heat, something concrete to hold on to. In any other context, there's no decision to make. You know what the response to that kind of move looks like. Yes. And you know why I can't make that response right now. Tell me you know why, Victor said. Not a challenge. Something more like a teacher asking a student to say the thing out loud, because saying it out loud was different from knowing it internally. Because Gerald is filing cooperative custody paperwork this week. Because in 3 to 6 months, I'm going to be in front of a family court judge who is going to assess whether I am a fit and present father. Because any action I take right now that resembles what I would normally do in this situation becomes evidence, discoverable evidence. Lorenzo said it cleanly, without self-pity. And because even if it weren't discoverable, I told Zarya I was trying to be something different. Taking that kind of action 2 weeks after saying that it's not who I told her I was trying to be. Victor drank his coffee. He looked at Lorenzo over the rim of the cup with eyes that had watched this man for 20 years and were watching him differently now. And what does that tell you? It tells me I have a problem with no clean solution. It tells you something more than that. Lorenzo looked at him. It tells you, Victor said, setting his cup down with a precision that was characteristic, that you've already made the decision, you just haven't said it yet. The kitchen was quiet. A clock somewhere in the house, ticking. Lorenzo thought about Ramon Cruz sitting across a table from Chen Wei in Chicago. He thought about what was in that conversation, what was traded, what intelligence about the organization's structure, and current vulnerabilities had changed hands over that table. He thought about what the appropriate response to that looked like, and then he thought about Marcus's fist closing around his finger in a park in the mountains, and the two images existed in his mind simultaneously and were absolutely irreconcilable. "I need to restructure," Lorenzo said. Victor waited. "The organization, fundamentally, not cosmetically. I don't mean better accounting or cleaner paperwork. I mean the actual structure of what we do and how we do it, shifted enough that the things I've been doing for 20 years are things I'm no longer doing." He paused. "That takes time. Months, maybe a year. And in the meantime, I have a Ramon Cruz problem that needs handling without the tools I'd normally use." "There are other tools," Victor said. "Legal ones. Some. And some that exist in the space between legal and not, but don't carry the specific risk of the other kind." Victor stood and went to the counter, refilled both cups. "Ramon Cruz has been operating in the Gulf. The Gulf operation has suppliers who file documentation, financial institutions that have compliance obligations. If certain information about certain transactions were to reach the attention of certain federal investigators who have been, shall we say, professionally interested in Gulf operations for the past 18 months, you'd be burning the Gulf operation. I'd be burning Ramon Cruz. There's a version of that where the Gulf operation survives with different management under a much cleaner structure, which is what you just said you wanted anyway." Victor sat back down. "It's slower. It's messier in some ways. But it's the kind of mess that doesn't show up in a family court proceeding." Lorenzo looked at him. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about this for 3 weeks," Victor said. "Since you sat on the kitchen floor." "You knew about that?" "I know about most things." He said it without apology. "I've been waiting for you to arrive at the question so I could offer the answer. You had to arrive at it yourself. If I'd handed it to you, you'd have weighed it as a tactical option and dismissed it." He looked at Lorenzo steadily. "You had to want to change first. The strategy could wait." Lorenzo sat back in the chair. Something in his chest that had been compressed for weeks shifted, not releasing exactly. There was too much still in motion for release, but moving, adjusting to a new configuration. "There are going to be people who see this as weakness," he said. "Yes. Inside the organization, if word gets out that I'm stepping back from certain operations, restructuring, there are people who'll read that as an opening. Some will. The ones who do will identify themselves, which is useful." Victor's voice was even. "And some of them will see it differently. You've been running this organization for 20 years. You've made people substantial money. You've kept structures stable through things that would have collapsed a lesser operation. There is a version of Lorenzo Kwan is restructuring that reads as evolution rather than retreat, if it's handled correctly." "And who handles it correctly?" "I do," Victor said simply. "That's what I'm here for." They sat at the kitchen table for another 90 minutes. By the time Lorenzo left Victor's house, there was a framework, not a plan, not yet, but the structural bones of one. Enough to work with, enough to take back to Gerald with new questions and take to Dominic with new directives. Enough to make Friday's meeting with Ramon Cruz a different kind of meeting than it would have been at 12:43 a.m. with Chen Wei's name burning in Lorenzo's hands. He drove back to Meridian Ridge with both phones on the seat beside him and let himself think, for the first time in weeks, not about what he was losing, but about what he was trying to build. It was uncomfortable. Building required a different mental posture than defending, and he'd been in a defensive crouch for so long that the shift felt almost physical. He had 2 days before Friday. He used them. He met with Gerald on Thursday morning and spent 4 hours going through not just the custody filing, but the broader legal architecture of his life. What his current exposure looked like, what a restructured operation would require in terms of documentation, what the distinction was between what he'd been and what he was trying to become in terms that a family court judge would find credible. Gerald was thorough and expensive and exactly what Lorenzo needed, and by the end of the 4 hours, they had something that resembled a roadmap. Gerald had said, at one point, with the careful neutrality of a man working hard to stay clinical, "The court is going to look at patterns, not just what you say you're going to do, what you've done consistently over time. 6 months of documented changed behavior is more convincing than 6 years of stated intention." "I understand. Do you understand that there's no shortcut? That you cannot leverage or negotiate your way through this particular process?" Lorenzo had looked at him. I understand. Gerald had nodded, with the expression of a man who would believe it when he saw it. Ramon Cruz arrived at Meridian Ridge on Friday at 2 in the afternoon. He came in a car with a driver, which was itself a statement, not the casual arrival of a man coming to check in, but the formal arrival of someone who had decided in advance what posture they were taking. He was 34 and had the physical confidence of a man who worked out seriously and knew it, and he walked through the front door of Meridian Ridge with the specific ease of someone who had rehearsed this in their head and was now executing. Lorenzo met him in the study. Not the kitchen, not the living room. The study, with the desk between them, the architecture of the room arranged to make something clear before a word was spoken. He did not offer Ramon a seat. He was standing at the window when Ramon came in, looking out at the oak trees, and he turned when Ramon entered but didn't come around the desk. Sit down, Lorenzo said. Ramon sat. His posture stayed easy, which meant he'd committed to the performance. Tell me about Chicago, Lorenzo said. The ease flickered. Just at the edges, just for a second, but Lorenzo had spent 20 years reading the flickers that happened before men knew they were flickering. I don't know what you're referring to. Chen Wei, Tuesday. The restaurant on Michigan Avenue. Lorenzo said it with the flatness of someone reading from a document, which he wasn't. Tell me about Chicago, Ramon. The ease didn't disappear. Ramon was too practiced for that, but it restructured itself into something different, the specific composition of a man who has realized his frame has been broken and is deciding in real time how to rebuild it. That was a preliminary conversation, Ramon said. Exploratory. Exploratory of what exactly? Supply chain alternatives. The Gulf operation has been under pressure, and you were looking at Chen Wei's network as an alternative infrastructure while I was distracted. Lorenzo walked around the desk slowly, not toward Ramon, parallel to him toward the bookcase, the deliberate, unhurried movement of a man who is not in a hurry because he's already determined the outcome. Let me tell you what I think happened. I think you watched 3 weeks of a distracted boss and you made a calculation. You decided the distraction might be permanent. You decided that the organization needed leadership that wasn't compromised by a personal situation. And you decided to have that conversation with Chen Wei because you thought you might need his infrastructure when you made your move. Ramon said nothing. That's the correct assessment, Lorenzo said. Say yes. A beat. It was premature. I shouldn't have. Say yes, Ramon. The room was very quiet. Ramon Cruz looked at Lorenzo Quan across the study and made the specific calculation of a man who has realized, too late, that he has misread the field. Yes, Ramon said. Thank you. Lorenzo came back around the desk and sat down across from him, deliberate and unhurried, and looked at him with eyes that were not performing anger, were not performing anything. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to give Victor a full account of every conversation you had during those 3 weeks. Every contact, every exchange, everything that went to Chen Wei. All of it, he paused. And then you're going to step back from the Gulf operation. Not fired, reassigned, different sector, different oversight, different structure. Victor will outline the details. Ramon's jaw tightened. You're benching me. I'm keeping you inside rather than putting you outside. That is an act of significant restraint on my part, given what you just admitted in this room, and I need you to understand the weight of that before you decide how to respond. The silence lasted long enough to have texture. The Gulf operation is being restructured anyway, Lorenzo said. What you walked into with Chen Wei is going to accelerate that timeline, because now I have to assume Wei knows things about our structure that he shouldn't. That's a problem you created. The restructuring cost you the Gulf and costs me 6 months of work. We're even on the accounting, but only if this conversation is the last conversation you have outside of proper channels. Ever. Ramon breathed through his nose. Something was working behind his eyes, and Lorenzo watched it work. The calculation of a man who was deciding whether the terms being offered were better than the alternative. They were. Ramon was smart enough to know they were. Understood, Ramon said. Good. Lorenzo stood, which ended the meeting. Victor will be in touch Monday. Ramon left. Lorenzo stood at the window after the car pulled out of the drive and let himself take one full breath that he'd been holding through the entire conversation. Not from fear. He hadn't been afraid of Ramon Cruz, not exactly. He'd been holding himself to a specific standard, keeping the part of himself that would have handled this differently chained to the back of the room, and that kind of containment took a physical toll. He'd handled it differently. It was done. His phone rang at 4:15. Gerald. The filing went through this morning. I have a response from her attorney. Lorenzo's hand tightened on the phone. What does it say? She's not contesting the filing. She's submitting her own documentation consistent with a supervised visitation structure. Gerald paused. Her attorney included a note, informal, not part of the official record, that says her client is prepared to work toward co-parenting if certain conditions are met consistently over the next 6 months. Lorenzo stood at his window with the oak trees in front of him and processed that sentence. Prepared to work toward. Not promising. Not forgiving. Prepared to consider the possibility. Contingent on evidence. It was, by any reasonable measure, more than he'd earned. Respond cooperatively, he said. Whatever conditions she's outlined, agree to them. All of them? Without review? Get me the list, but yes, agree to them. Gerald got him the list. Supervised visits twice weekly at a neutral location to be arranged through a family mediator. Mandatory participation in a co-parenting counseling program. Documentation of any changes in Lorenzo's residential or professional situation provided to her attorney within 72 hours. A 6-month review period before any modification to the arrangement could be requested. Lorenzo read the list twice. I thought about which items he would have pushed back on 2 months ago, which ones would have felt like concessions too far, which ones would have prompted a counteroffer designed to reclaim ground. He sent Gerald a message. Agree to all. The first supervised visit was scheduled for the following Wednesday. A family mediation center 40 minutes from Meridian Ridge, neutral territory. A room designed to be neither his world nor hers, just a room where a father and his son could occupy the same space under conditions that protected everyone. Lorenzo arrived 12 minutes early. He sat in the parking lot and looked at the building. A converted Victorian house, painted a sensible gray, with a wooden sign out front, and did the thing he'd been doing more often lately, which was just sitting with where he was rather than planning what came next. He was wearing the same kind of clothes he'd worn to the park. Nothing that communicated hierarchy. Zarya arrived with Marcus at exactly the scheduled time. She was accompanied by a woman from the mediation center, a neutral party, and she nodded at Lorenzo in the parking lot with the cool, careful nod of someone maintaining professional distance over something deeply personal. He nodded back. Inside, the room had toys on the floor and good lighting and chairs arranged in a way that didn't feel like a courtroom. The mediator, a woman named Paula, 50s, with the specific calm of someone who had sat in a lot of rooms like this with a lot of people like them, explained the session structure briefly and then stepped back and let it happen. Zarya set Marcus on the floor mat. Marcus, 5 months old now, and considerably more mobile than the park version, immediately found a stacking toy and began engaging with it with enormous seriousness. He was not yet crawling properly, but he could rotate and reach with an efficiency that seemed disproportionate to his age. Lorenzo sat on the floor, not in a chair. On the floor, cross-legged, at Marcus's level, because the chair felt like the wrong distance. Paula made a small note. Zarya, from her chair at the edge of the room, watched this without expression. "Hey, bud," Lorenzo said. Marcus looked up from the stacking toy. Looked at Lorenzo with the serious, categorizing attention of a 5-month-old encountering a face they've seen before but haven't filed yet. Lorenzo picked up one of the rings from the stacking toy and held it out. Marcus looked at it. Lorenzo waited. Marcus reached out and took it, then immediately tried to put it in his mouth, which was the developmentally appropriate response, and also, in the specific context of this room, made Lorenzo almost smile in a way that caught him off guard. "That's not—" "Yeah, okay," Lorenzo said quietly. "That's one way to use it." He stayed on the floor for the full hour of the supervised visit. He didn't perform. He didn't monologue about fatherhood. He sat on the floor and followed Marcus's lead and learned, in the specific way that you can only learn something by doing it rather than planning it, what his son found interesting: stacking and unstacking. The specific texture of a crinkle book, the action of reaching for something just out of reach, and the satisfaction, visible on his face, clear as weather, of successfully grabbing it. An hour. It wasn't enough. It was also more than he'd had in months. And he understood without anyone telling him that the path to more ran directly through being present for this, without asking for more than this. He stood when Paula indicated the session was concluding. He looked at Marcus, who was now being picked up by Zarya, who was watching Lorenzo with the contained, careful expression she'd been wearing since the park. Same time next week? Lorenzo asked. Not of her, of Paula. Same time next week, Paula confirmed. He walked out to the parking lot. He sat in his car for a moment. He'd expected the hour to feel like less than it was. He'd expected the supervised structure to feel demeaning, controlled, the kind of condition that a man like him endured rather than accepted. It hadn't felt like that. It had felt like an hour with his son. A limited, conditional, monitored hour, but real. He drove back to Meridian Ridge and sat at the kitchen table with the organization reports that Dominic had sent and worked through them for 2 hours, and then put them aside and picked up the parenting book he'd ordered 4 days ago that was sitting unread on the counter because he'd ordered it, and then felt absurd for ordering it, and then felt more absurd for feeling absurd. He opened it. It was not a book written for men who ran criminal organizations. It was written for ordinary fathers who had ordinary anxieties about doing right by their children. And the voice was patient and uncondescending and covered things Lorenzo genuinely did not know. Developmental stages, how to read infant cues, what different kinds of crying indicated, how to establish trust with a child who was still categorizing the world from scratch. He read 50 pages before he put it down. He was not good at this yet. I was aware of not being good at it. That awareness, not shame exactly, but the clear-eyed recognition of a gap between where he was and where he needed to be, was something he'd always been able to apply to organizational problems. Identify the deficit, build the competency, close the gap. He'd never applied it to anything personal. He was applying it now. The second week, the third, the fourth. Each Wednesday, the same room, the same neutral light, the same Paula with her small notebook and her professional calm, and Marcus growing by increments that Lorenzo was beginning to track, not from reports, not from secondhand information, but from personal observation, week over week. The way Marcus's reach was getting more accurate, the sounds he was making that were starting to differentiate, to carry intent. On the fourth visit, Marcus was on the floor with a set of soft blocks, and Lorenzo was sitting across from him, and Marcus looked up and directly at Lorenzo's face and made a sound, a specific sound, not language, not a word, but directed, aimed, like he was trying to tell Lorenzo something about the block. Lorenzo looked at the block. He looked at Marcus. That one? He said, and picked up the blue block Marcus seemed to be indicating. Marcus made the sound again, with emphasis. Lorenzo handed him the block. Marcus took it with both hands and a satisfaction that was enormous and disproportionate and entirely perfect, and then looked back up at Lorenzo with the expression of a person who has just had a successful communication and is pleased about it. Paula made a note. Zarya, from her chair at the edge of the room, was looking not at Marcus but at Lorenzo. And when Lorenzo glanced over, she looked away. But he'd seen it. The specific quality of what had been in her face for that 2-second window was not warmth, and it was not forgiveness, and it was not anything he was going to build on or reference or push toward. It was something smaller and more honest than any of those things. It was the expression of a woman watching the father of her child do something right, and not yet knowing what to do with that. He drove home from the fourth visit with that expression sitting with him in the car, not because he was cataloging it or calculating what it meant for his position, but because it mattered to him in a way that had nothing to do with leverage and everything to do with something he was still learning to name. The fifth week brought a different kind of development. Victor called on a Tuesday evening with news about the Gulf restructuring that was tighter and more complicated than expected. And the call went long, and by the time Lorenzo finished and looked up, it was past midnight, and he'd been at his desk for 4 hours. He noticed he was tired in a way he used to dismiss. The organizational mind running too hot, running through problems at a pace that didn't stop. He closed the laptop. He went to the nursery. He'd been doing this, going to the empty nursery, not as a punishment, not to suffer, just to remind himself of the geography of what he was working toward. The crib, the stars on the sheet, the mobile turning in the draft. His phone buzzed. He expected Victor. He expected Dominic with a follow-up. It was Zarya's attorney. 11:47 p.m., which was unusual enough that his heart moved in his chest before he read the message. Ms. Brooks Kwan has asked me to forward you something. This is not part of the formal process. You are not required to respond through official channels. She wanted you to have it. Attached was a video. 38 seconds, shot on a phone, slightly unsteady, the mountain town house in the background. Zarya's voice off camera, saying something soft he couldn't make out. And Marcus, 6 months old, rounder, and more present every week, sitting propped against a cushion on the floor. Laughing. Not smiling. Laughing. The full-body, unqualified, entirely helpless laugh of a baby who has found something funny, and whatever Zarya had done off camera, she did again, and Marcus laughed again. And the sound of it came through the phone speaker in Lorenzo's hand in the empty nursery at 11:47 at night. Lorenzo stood at the empty crib and watched 38 seconds of his son laughing 3 times. He watched it again. He watched it 6 times. Then he sat down on the floor of the nursery. The second time he'd sat on a floor in 2 months, which was more floor-sitting than the previous 39 years combined, and held the phone and listened to Marcus laugh until he had it memorized, until the sound of it was somewhere inside him that wasn't going away. His hands were shaking slightly. He noticed that. A man who had held positions of enormous consequence without his hands shaking, sitting on the floor of an empty nursery with his hands shaking over 38 seconds of video. He typed a message to Zarya's attorney. Please tell her thank you. He set the phone down. From somewhere in the house, a clock marked midnight with a single sound. Lorenzo Kwan sat on the nursery floor and understood. Not as strategy, not as calculation, but as something that had arrived in him the same way the video had, unexpectedly and completely. That he was going to dismantle the life he'd built. Not because a court was making him, not because Zarya was requiring it, but because his son laughed like that, and he had not been there to hear it, and the number of things he was willing to sacrifice to make sure he was there for the next laugh he was discovering everything, not most things. Everything. And the moment that understanding settled, clear and irreversible, the particular quality of a decision that doesn't feel like a decision because it's simply true. His phone rang again, and it was Victor, and Victor's voice was tight in a way that happened almost never. There's a problem, Victor said. Chenwei didn't just have dinner with Ramon. Lorenzo got off the floor. Tell me. He's been building a case, financial exposure, organizational structure, specific transactions from the past 4 years. Someone inside gave him documentation. Victor's voice was very controlled. Lorenzo, this isn't a competitive move. This is leverage. He's going to use it. Lorenzo stood in the nursery doorway with his phone and looked at the mobile still turning in the draft. Use it how? He said. To take the organization, or to hand what he has to federal investigators and let them do it for him. Victor paused. Either way, it moves in the next 72 hours. He's already made contact with someone at the U.S. Attorney's Office. We have about 3 days before this becomes something none of us can manage. Lorenzo looked at the mobile. He looked at the phone in his hand with Marcus's laugh still somewhere in his chest. He looked at the door of the nursery and the hallway beyond it and the house around him, this monument to 20 years of building something that someone was now preparing to bring down in 72 hours. Get Dominic, he said. Get Gerald. Get everyone in the same room by morning. And then what? Victor asked. Lorenzo looked at the mobile one more time. And then I make a decision that I should have made a long time ago, he said, and we figure out together how to survive it. The meeting happened at 4:30 in the morning in Victor's dining room, not Meridian Ridge. Victor's house, with the family photographs in the hallway and the worn kitchen table, because Lorenzo had understood instinctively that what needed to happen in the next few hours required a room that had nothing to do with the organization. It required a room where people had eaten dinner together and argued about ordinary things and come back to each other afterward. Gerald Fitch arrived first, at 4:17, in the clothes of a man who had been sleeping and then wasn't. Dominic Park arrived 4 minutes later, driving himself, no driver, which meant he understood the gravity without being told. Victor was already there, had been there, had made coffee that nobody was drinking because coffee felt beside the point. Lorenzo stood at the head of the table. He hadn't sat down. He'd been standing since he arrived, and he was still standing when the last of them settled, and he looked at the 3 men in front of him. 20 years of combined loyalty, a collective architecture of everything he'd built, and said what he'd decided in the nursery doorway. I'm going to cooperate with the U.S. Attorney's Office. The room received this differently, depending on who you were watching. Gerald went very still in the way that attorneys go still when they are rapidly processing liability. Dominic's jaw moved once, like he'd started a word and decided against it. Victor looked at Lorenzo with the expression of a man who had suspected this was coming and had not allowed himself to fully believe it until now. "Define cooperate," Gerald said. His voice was professional, the reflex of a man whose entire function was precision. "I mean, a proffer agreement. I mean, sitting across from the U.S. attorney's people and telling them what I know, in exchange for a negotiated resolution that accounts for cooperation." Lorenzo said it evenly. "I mean that Chenwei's leverage disappears because I take it away from him. He can't use documentation against me if I've already handed it to the people he was going to hand it to." "That's not," Dominic started. "Let me finish." "Not loud. Just final." Dominic closed his mouth. "The organization as it currently exists is over. That happened before tonight. I've known it since I sat in a family mediation room with my son and understood that the thing I was trying to become and the thing I've been cannot occupy the same future." He looked at all three of them in turn. "What I'm offering tonight is the version of ending this that I control, rather than the version that Chenwei controls, or the version that ends with federal agents at the door of Meridian Ridge and no negotiating position at all." Gerald opened his briefcase. He was already thinking, Lorenzo could see it, the attorney's mind moving through frameworks, precedents, proffer structures, immunity considerations. This requires very careful handling. The negotiation of a cooperation agreement at this level is, I know what it requires. That's why you're here at 4:30 in the morning. There are people in the organization who will not. Dominic stopped himself. He tried again. There are people who will take this as a betrayal, Lorenzo said. Say it. Dominic looked at him. Yes. Some of them, yes. Some of them will understand that the alternative was worse. Some of them will find their way through whatever restructuring follows. And some of them, he paused, some of them I cannot protect. That's the price. I know what the price is. Dominic sat back in his chair. He looked at the table. He was 53 years old and had made his life inside the structure Lorenzo was now describing dismantling, and the thing moving across his face was not simple anger. It was grief, the specific grief of a man watching the end of something he'd built his identity around. Lorenzo saw it and didn't look away from it. He owed Dominic that. I'm not disappearing, Lorenzo said. I'm not leaving the country. I'm not going into hiding. I'm going to sit across from the U.S. attorney's people with Gerald, and I'm going to negotiate a resolution that is as protective as possible of everyone who can be protected, and I'm going to accept the consequences that apply to me personally. He paused. That probably includes a period of time that I won't enjoy. Prison, Dominic said flatly. Possibly. Likely a negotiated term, dependent on the scope of cooperation. Gerald will fight for the best available outcome. Lorenzo looked at Gerald. You'll fight for the best available outcome. That's what you pay me for, Gerald said, which was the most human thing Gerald Fitch had said in 11 years of working together. The Chenwei situation, Victor said. He'd been quiet through all of this, which meant he'd been listening at a depth the others weren't. If you move first, before he makes contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office, then we arrive before he does. His documentation becomes redundant because I've already provided it and more. His leverage evaporates. Lorenzo finally sat down. The sitting had weight to it, the specific weight of a man who has made the largest decision of his life and is now on the other side of making it. He loses everything he spent the last several months building, and he loses it because I took the action he was holding over my head. Victor nodded once, small, satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with winning. There's something else, Lorenzo said. He reached into his jacket and put a folder on the table. He'd prepared this at the house before driving to Victor's, printed it from files he'd been maintaining since his conversation with Gerald about restructuring. Inside the folder were documentation of specific accounts, specific transactions, specific relationships that had nothing to do with the criminal side of the operation, the legitimate businesses he'd built alongside, the investment structures, the real estate holdings that had been acquired cleanly. There's a legitimate company underneath all of this, he said. It's always been there. It got buried, or I buried it, because the other side was more lucrative. He looked at Dominic. That's what survives. Import, logistics, real estate, real, documented, operating in the actual legal world. I want you to run it. Dominic looked at the folder. He didn't touch it yet. You're serious? You're the only person I trust to do it correctly, and you'll need something to do when all of this reorganizes. A beat. So will I eventually, when I'm in a position to work again. Dominic picked up the folder. He opened it and looked at the first page and then at Lorenzo and then back at the page, and something in his face moved from grief towards something more complicated, the beginning of a recalculation. I'll look at it, Dominic said. That's all I'm asking. Gerald started making calls at 5 a.m. The U.S. Attorney's Office in this district had a specific contact that Gerald had maintained at careful distance for years, the kind of contact that existed in case of exactly this situation, the professional relationship of a defense attorney who served clients who might someday need a door opened. That door opened at 5:14 a.m., with a brief and precise communication from Gerald that contained the words proactive cooperation and substantial assistance and a proposed meeting time of 9 a.m. the same morning. The response came back at 5:51, confirmed. Lorenzo showered at Victor's house, in the guest bathroom, in borrowed clothes because he hadn't brought anything. The borrowed clothes were Victor's. They were close enough in size that it worked, though Victor's shirt was slightly wide in the shoulders. Lorenzo stood at the guest bathroom mirror and looked at himself in someone else's shirt and thought that this was probably the most accurate representation of where he was. Borrowed circumstances, unfamiliar fit, working with what was available. Victor knocked on the door at 7. There's food. I'm not hungry. I know, there's food anyway. He ate toast at Victor's kitchen table. Victor sat across from him and didn't talk, which was the correct response to the morning. Outside the kitchen window, the suburb was beginning its ordinary day. A neighbor walking a dog, a car backing out of a driveway, the specific American normalcy of a Tuesday morning that had no idea it was a Tuesday morning in which everything was different. Are you afraid? Victor asked. Lorenzo considered the question honestly, which he might not have done 6 months ago. Of the process? No. I've sat across tables from dangerous people my entire adult life. He turned the toast in his hands. I'm afraid of the timeline, of how much time this is going to take away from Marcus. Victor nodded. He's 6 months old, Lorenzo said. If this results in a 2-year term, and Gerald thinks 2 years is a realistic target with full cooperation, that's 2 years of visits through a facility. That's not... He stopped. That's not what I said I was going to be. It's not what you chose, Victor said. It's what the choices you made previously are costing you. There's a difference. I know the difference. Marcus will be 2.5 when you're out. He won't remember the visits. He'll remember the father he has from that point forward. Victor said this with the directness of a man who is not offering comfort, only accuracy. The question is who you are when you come out. That's the question you can actually control. Lorenzo looked at him. You've had this speech prepared. I've had it prepared for about a month, Victor said. I wasn't sure when it would be needed. The meeting with the U.S. Attorney's office happened in a conference room in a federal building that looked like every federal building, fluorescent lit, carpeted in something sensible and depressing, furnished with tables and chairs designed to communicate the weight of institutional authority without any of the aesthetic investment. Lorenzo sat on one side with Gerald. 2 assistant U.S. attorneys and a federal agent sat on the other. The meeting lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Lorenzo said more honest things in those 4 hours than he'd said in the preceding 20 years. And the saying of them was not cathartic, not dramatic, not the purging that people in films experience when they confess. It was methodical and exhausting, and several times he had to stop and breathe through something before he could continue, because some of the things he was describing were things he hadn't let himself look at directly in years. And looking at them directly in a fluorescent-lit federal conference room with 2 attorneys making notes was an experience that had a specific quality he hadn't anticipated. It felt like surgery, necessary and painful, and not something you could stop in the middle of. Gerald negotiated throughout. He was, Lorenzo thought at several points, the best version of himself in that room. Sharp and precise and unyielding on the points that mattered, giving ground only where giving ground served the larger objective. By the end of the 4 hours, they had the framework of a cooperation agreement that would reduce Lorenzo's exposure significantly in exchange for testimony and documentation that the U.S. Attorney's Office had wanted for the better part of 3 years. Chenwei's name appeared early in the documentation Lorenzo provided. He had the specific satisfaction of knowing that Chenwei's carefully constructed leverage had been rendered entirely worthless before Chenwei had woken up that Tuesday morning. It wasn't victory. It was something more austere than victory, the particular quality of having survived a thing by running directly at it rather than away from it. The formal agreement was finalized over the following 3 weeks. Gerald worked with a precision and dedication that Lorenzo recognized as the work of a man who was also closing a chapter of his own professional life. Gerald would not be doing this kind of work again after this, and both of them understood that without discussing it. The plea and cooperation agreement, when finalized, carried a sentence of 18 months in a federal facility with credit for time served during the processing period and the possibility of early release conditional on continued cooperation. Gerald had fought for 2 years to get to 18 months, and he'd gotten there. Lorenzo stood outside the federal building after the final hearing, in November air that was cold and very clear, and called Zaria's attorney. "I need to tell her directly," he said. "Not through you, I need to call her." A pause. "I'll ask her." Zaria called him 40 minutes later. He was sitting in his car outside the federal building, the engine off, watching people come and go through the glass doors, and her name appeared on his screen, and he answered it on the first ring. "I heard from my attorney," she said. Not hello, not his name, just the fact of what she knew. "I wanted you to hear it from me." 18 months. Yes. A silence. Not an empty one. A silence with things moving through it, things she was processing and deciding whether to say. "Marcus will be almost 2, she said. "I know." "Were you... Is this..." She stopped. He could hear her breathing, the specific quality of someone who is trying to be careful and is finding it difficult. "Was this your choice, or did you not have one?" He thought about the nursery, the mobile, the 38 seconds of video. "I had a choice," he said. "I could have run. I had resources, I had time. I had people who would have helped. I chose not to." He paused. "I chose not to because of what I'm trying to be, and because the life I would have had if I ran was not a life that Marcus could be part of." Another silence. Longer. "Okay," she said. "Just that. But the quality of it. Not warm, not forgiving, not any of the things he might have hoped for once, but honest and real and acknowledging something, was more than nothing, considerably more." "I'd like to see him before I have to report," Lorenzo said. "Not through the mediation center, just, if you're willing, a real visit. With both of us there, not a mediator." She was quiet for long enough that he thought she was going to say no. "Saturday," she said, 11 o'clock. I'll bring him to Meridian Ridge." He almost said thank you and stopped himself because thank you was too small for this, and she would know it was too small. Instead, he said, "Saturday at 11, and she said, "Don't be late," and ended the call. He sat in the car outside the federal building for a long time after that. He thought about the version of himself that had walked through the gates of Meridian Ridge 6 months ago at 6:43 in the morning and found a wedding ring on a marble counter and a nursery that didn't have his son in it anymore. That man had stood in the kitchen and not understood what he was looking at. He'd understood the facts. Wife gone, son gone, ring left behind. But he hadn't understood what they meant about who he was. He understood now. Saturday came with the specific quality of November light in Virginia, pale and without warmth, but very clear, the kind of light that makes everything look defined and exact. Lorenzo had spent the days before it preparing Meridian Ridge in ways that were small and specific. A mat on the living room floor, soft toys he'd bought, and then researched to make sure were age-appropriate, the nursery cleaned and the mobile wound up and turning, even though Marcus wouldn't be sleeping there. He'd wound up the mobile because it seemed like the right thing to do, like keeping a lamp on. Zaria arrived at 11:01. She drove herself, no attorney, no mediator, which was the first time in months they'd been in the same space without professional architecture between them. She got out of the car and unstrapped Marcus from his seat and walked up to the front door, and Lorenzo opened it before she could knock. Marcus saw him and did the thing he'd started doing in the mediation center. The recognition response, the particular alerting of a baby who has categorized a face and is now registering its presence. His arms moved outward slightly, the beginning of a reach. Lorenzo felt that reach in the center of his chest like a physical thing. "Come in," he said to Zarya. She came in. She walked through the entry hall she'd once lived in, and Lorenzo watched her take in the space. Different now. Some things moved. The quality of the house altered by months of one person living in it rather than two. With an expression that wasn't quite neutral, wasn't quite anything he could name. They sat on the floor of the living room. All three of them, on the mat, with Marcus between them engaged with the stacking toy that Lorenzo had bought specifically because Marcus had demonstrated strong opinions about stacking toys in the mediation center. For the first 20 minutes, they talked through Marcus. He's been doing this. He started doing that, the pediatrician said. The conversational structure of two parents sharing information about a child, which was its own kind of intimacy and its own kind of distance. Then there was a pause, and in the pause, Zarya looked at Lorenzo directly, the full weight of it, the way she'd looked at him in the park. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Of going in?" "Yes." He thought about lying. Not seriously, but the reflex was there. The old reflex of presenting a version of himself that didn't admit to the things that made him smaller than the reputation. He let it pass. "Yes," he said. She nodded. Not with sympathy, not yet, but with the acknowledgement of a woman who had asked a real question and received a real answer and knew the difference. "Good," she said quietly. "That means you're paying attention." Marcus, between them, stacked 2 rings successfully and looked up at both of them with the enormous satisfaction of someone who has accomplished something. Lorenzo looked at his son's face. 6.5 months of life, and the amount of person already present in that face was extraordinary. Specific, individual, Marcus rather than a baby, already carrying something that was his alone. Lorenzo thought about who this person was going to be at 5, at 10, at 17, and how much of that would be built in the years Lorenzo was going to be present, and how much in the years he wasn't. "I'm going to write to him," Lorenzo said. "While I'm in, letters. I know he can't read them yet, but I'll keep them," Zarya said. "When he's old enough, he can read them." Lorenzo looked at her. She was looking at Marcus, her profile to him, and there was something in the line of her jaw and the set of her shoulders that was the architecture of a woman who had been through enormous difficulty and had come out the other side not unaffected but intact. More than intact. She had built an actual life. In the mountains, in the small town, with the police chief who answered her calls and the neighbors who knew her name and the house that was hers and the child she was raising into a person. She had done that, alone, under pressure, in circumstances that would have collapsed someone less specifically constructed. "Zarya," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not going to say I'm sorry, because I've said it, and you've heard it, and it doesn't—" He stopped. "What I want to say is that I see what you built. In 6 months, starting from nothing, you built a life for him that it's real. It's the kind of thing I don't know how to build." He paused. "I'm going to learn how. I have 18 months and then a long time after that to figure out how to build something real instead of something impressive. I wanted you to know that I see the difference now." She held his gaze. She was not going to cry. He could see that, the deliberate maintenance of herself in this moment. But something in her eyes changed, just briefly, the fracture line of something that had been held very tightly for a long time. "You have a long way to go," she said. "I know. I'm not waiting for you. I'm not asking you to." She looked at him for one more second, and then she looked at Marcus, and she breathed out slowly through her nose. And what she was breathing out was something she'd been carrying. Not the pain of the affair, not the anger of abandonment, but the specific weight of waiting to see if this man was going to become someone she could trust to parent her son. She hadn't decided yet. He understood that. It was too soon and the history was too complicated and trust was not something she was going to hand over. But she was here, in this house, on this floor, watching Marcus stack rings between them. And that was something he was going to have to earn a day at a time for a very long time. And he understood that now not as a strategic obstacle, but as the actual truth of what love, damaged and restructured, required. Lorenzo reported to the federal facility on a Thursday in December. He drove himself. Gerald had offered to accompany him and he'd declined because there were things that should be done alone, and arriving at the beginning of a sentence you'd chosen was one of them. He stood in the parking lot for a moment before going in. The air was cold. There was a line of trees at the perimeter of the facility, bare-branched in December, and beyond them a gray sky that was pressing down toward the horizon. He thought about Marcus, the specific laugh from the 38-second video, which he had memorized so thoroughly that he could hear it without the phone, could reconstruct it internally with a fidelity that was almost physical. He thought about the swing set in the park on Cedar Street in the mountain town, which he'd noticed on his one visit there, and which Marcus would probably be large enough to use by the time Lorenzo was in a position to push him on it. I thought about the letters he was going to write, stacked up in Zaria's house in the mountains, waiting for the version of Marcus who could read them. He'd thought about what to write in those letters for weeks, trying different approaches in his head, and had arrived finally at the simplest possible thing, the truth. Who his father had been, who he'd tried to become, what the distance between those two things had cost everyone, and what he was doing about it. Not dressed up, not softened. The truth, in ordinary language, letter by letter, for a person who deserved to know all of it someday. He went inside. The next 18 months were not a story, they were a practice. He worked through them the way you work through something that requires repetition before it becomes genuine. Parenting classes offered through the facility, which he attended without irony and without the specific removed attention of a man who thinks the material is beneath him. He did the reading, he did the coursework. He wrote the letters on Wednesday and Saturday evenings, sitting at a small table in a small room, drafting and redrafting, not trying to be eloquent, trying to be honest. He wrote one letter to Zaria, not in the context of the other letters, not shared through the attorney. He wrote it separately and asked Gerald to pass it to her directly, and made clear there was no expectation of response. She didn't respond. He didn't expect her to. The letter said what it said, and she could do with it what she wanted, and the point of writing it was not to get something back but to put something out into the world that was true, which was what he was practicing. Victor managed the legitimate business. Dominic ran it with a seriousness and a competence that Lorenzo heard about through their bi-monthly approved phone calls. And what he heard was not what he'd expected, which was Dominic managing something down to its minimum, but Dominic building something. The logistics company had 3 new contracts by month 6. The real estate side was being restructured with a legal team that Gerald had assembled. It was smaller than what Lorenzo had operated before, considerably smaller, and it was clean. Clean was a word Lorenzo had not previously thought much about. He thought about it now. Ramon Cruz was gone. Not in the way that people in the organization sometimes went. He was simply outside of it, his own choices having narrowed his options sufficiently that departure was the best available outcome. Where he went and what he did was no longer Lorenzo's concern. Chenway was a separate story. The cooperation agreement had provided the U.S. Attorney's Office with documentation that Chenway's own lawyers were spending considerable time and money responding to. He was not Lorenzo's problem anymore either, and the particular satisfaction of that was something Lorenzo sat with occasionally when the days were long. That a man who had spent months constructing leverage against him had ended up worse off than the man he was trying to leverage. The 18 months resolved in June, on a day that was warm and clear, the sky the specific blue of early summer that Lorenzo associated with no particular memory until he walked out of the federal facility and stood in the parking lot and thought, this is a memory I'm making right now. Victor was in the parking lot. I was leaning against his car with his jacket over his arm, squinting slightly against the sun, looking the same as he had looked on every other occasion in 20 years, except for something around the eyes that was different now and that Lorenzo didn't try to name immediately. They stood in the parking lot for a moment. How do you feel? Victor asked. Like myself, Lorenzo said. A version of myself I haven't met before. Victor nodded. He opened the car door. Get in. We're going to Dominic's. They went to Dominic's, where there was food and a table of people who had known Lorenzo for most of his adult life, and the meal was quiet by the standards of what those gatherings used to be and more real than any of them had been. 6 weeks after his release, on a Saturday in August, Lorenzo drove to the mountain town for the first time since the park on Cedar Street. He'd been in contact with Zaria through the proper channels. Her attorney, the parenting coordinator who had continued managing the schedule, the framework that had been built and maintained over his entire sentence. He'd written to Marcus. He'd received twice photographs sent through the coordinator without comment of Marcus at 8 months and then at 14 months. And he'd kept them on the small table in his room at the facility and looked at them every day. Marcus was now almost 2. He drove through the mountains in the August heat with the windows down, the road he'd driven once before, the same trees and the same narrowing as you got higher, the same columns of morning light. The house was different from how he'd imagined it. Smaller, with a yard that had been clearly worked on, a garden along one fence that was clearly Zarya's because it had the specific order within abundance quality of something she'd designed. There was a swing set in the yard. He sat in the car for a moment. Then he got out. Zarya met him on the front porch. She was in the clothes of a weekend at home, and her hair was down, and she looked at him with the assessment she had given him in the park 2 years ago, the full weight of it, measuring the distance between who she'd last seen and who was standing on her porch now. Whatever she was looking for, she found enough of it. "He's in the yard," she said. He followed her around the side of the house. Marcus was at the swing set, not swinging, standing beside it, pushing one of the swings with both hands and watching it come back with the focused attention of a person conducting an experiment. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and was wearing a red shirt and sneakers that were already dirty, and he was almost 2 years old and entirely himself, entirely a person, and when he heard footsteps he turned and looked. He looked at Lorenzo. Lorenzo stopped. Marcus looked at him for the long, serious moment of a toddler conducting a categorization. His eyes moved across Lorenzo's face with the thoroughness of someone who had learned to recognize things and was now deciding whether this particular thing was known or unknown. And then something resolved in his expression. Not a memory, he was too young for memory, but a registered familiarity. Something from the letters or the photographs or the visits in the facility room where Marcus had sat on his lap and they had looked at board books together for 45 approved minutes at a time. Marcus let go of the swing. He walked across the grass toward Lorenzo with the specific unsteady confidence of a toddler who has mastered walking recently enough that it's still an achievement worth being pleased about. He walked to Lorenzo and stopped about 2 feet away and looked up at him. Then he reached up and grabbed 2 of Lorenzo's fingers with his whole hand, with that total, unqualified grip that he'd had since the park in the mountains, and turned and tried to pull him toward the swing set, because the swing was the thing currently under investigation and he had identified a useful person to assist. Lorenzo let himself be pulled. He sat in the grass beside the swing set and held the swing steady while Marcus pushed it, and when Marcus decided he wanted to be on the swing instead, Lorenzo lifted him and set him in the seat and held him there, one hand on his back and one on the chain, and pushed. Gently. Very gently. The smallest arc. Marcus grabbed the chains on both sides and looked out at the yard ahead of him with the expression of a person encountering a new thing and deciding, after the first second, that it was acceptable, and then, after the second second, that it was excellent. He laughed. Not the recorded laugh, the 38-second video laugh that Lorenzo had memorized in a nursery doorway and carried through 18 months of consequence. This one, now, in the August air, with his son on a swing, in the yard of a house in the mountains, and Zarya watching from the porch with her arms crossed, and the complicated, honest, unresolved face of a woman who had not forgiven everything and was not pretending to, but who was also watching the father of her son push their child on a swing and who was allowing it. This laugh was in real time. Lorenzo pushed the swing again. Marcus laughed again. From the porch, Zarya watched the two of them. Her jaw had the tension of something being held, and her eyes were doing the thing where they were very bright and very still at the same time. She was not going to tell Lorenzo what she was feeling in this moment. That was hers, and she was entitled to it being hers. But she didn't go inside. She stayed on the porch in the August afternoon with her arms crossed and her eyes on her son, and the man who was trying finally, in the only way that actually counted, not with money, not with power, not with the controlled application of whatever he had that other people wanted, but simply by being there, by showing up on a Saturday morning and sitting in the grass and pushing a swing. Lorenzo pushed the swing and felt the August sun on his back and listened to his son laugh and understood, with the specific clarity of a man who has paid for his understanding at considerable cost, that this ordinary, unimpressive, unmonumental moment was the thing he had nearly lost forever. Not the house, not the organization, not the reputation or the resources or the 20 years of building something that other men feared. This. A red-shirted, almost 2-year-old on a swing in a mountain town yard, laughing into the warm afternoon, reaching back for the push that would send him forward again. Lorenzo gave him the push. Marcus went forward into the August air with his hands on the chains, and his face turned up toward the sky, still laughing, already leaning back for the return, already trusting that the hands behind him would be there when the swing came back. They were.